Aujourd'hui, on a la joie d'avoir Anne qui va nous faire un séminaire. Alors, je ne présente pas Anne puisque vous la connaissez. Mais donc, elle va nous faire un séminaire où elle va nous montrer comment on peut utiliser la sismologie pour regarder comment fonctionne, bougent, évoluent des glaciers ou des glissements de terrain. Voilà, sa spécialité. Merci.
Merci Marc. Donc effectivement, ici, je vais essayer de vous montrer en fait comment on peut utiliser les ondes qui sont générées par les glissements de terrain ou les glaciers pour retrouver des informations sur leur dynamique. Et c'est un travail qu'on a fait depuis une dizaine d'années en collaboration avec des spécialistes en sismologie, volcanologie, physique, mécanique, acoustique et mathématiques pour tout ce qui est développement de modèles. Et aussi le résultat de travail de plusieurs étudiants en thèse, en postdoc, collaboration avec des ingénieurs et les observatoires, notamment volcanologiques de La Réunion. Voilà, donc d'abord je vais vous montrer je vais vous décrire les grands challenges qui se posent en fait dans la compréhension des glaciers et des glissements de terrain et dans leur intégration dans le système Terre d'une certaine manière, et la méthode un peu générale pour utiliser les ondes sismiques qu'ils génèrent afin d'avoir des informations sur ces processus. Ensuite, je vous parlerai plus spécifiquement de ce qu'on appelle des glacial earthquakes. Donc c'est des... Ah, excusez-moi, là je suis parlé en français, mais est-ce que quelqu'un ici ne parle pas français? Non, ok. I can switch in English if you prefer. Okay. Well, so I will speak here about how we can use the low-frequency signal to recover the characteristics of the glacial earthquake, which are actually processes that are related to the iceberg calving, and also how we can use this seismic wave to recover the iceberg volume. Then I will speak about the same kind of methodology that will help us to use seismic data to recover the force generated by landslides, and from this force to recover their volume and also their rheology. And then I will speak about how we can use the high-frequency seismic data, which is much more difficult, and how all this can help us to monitor landslide activity, and in particular to link it with the volcanic activity. So first introduction. Glacier and landslide play a key role in erosion processes at the surface of the Earth and also on telluric planets, and they are linked to risk and hazards, and in particular glaciers are related to climate change and to sea level rise, and landslide represent a high risk for population and infrastructure in seismic, volcanic, and also coastal areas, in particular in volcanic islands, where this landslide can enter the sea and generate tsunamis that can propagate along the coast. And all these natural events are recorded by satellite imagery, and we have quite a lot of an increase of high-quality satellite data, but with a low time resolution. And in fact, all this process generates seismic waves, and these seismic waves can propagate very far and can be used to recover information on the dynamics of this process. And you can see here examples of two seismograms, one recorded in Greenland and one recorded in Montserrat. And you can see here at the beginning what is called seismic noise. And we know very well now that this seismic noise is generated by the ocean waves, and you can observe it all over the Earth. And after, for example, here in Greenland, you can see the signal of an ice avalanche followed by several seismic events that are in fact iceberg calving, as you can see in this picture. And I will come back to that later. And here you can see in Montserrat the record of a pyroclastic flow that is flowing down the slope here. And what is, depending on the size of this event, so iceberg can reach size of cubic kilometers, and landslide of also cubic kilometers, and depending on their size, they can generate signal with magnitude up to 4 and 5 that are recorded at tens to hundreds of kilometers from the source, and it provides a huge database that we have since tens of years that is really unexploited due to the difficulty of extracting information from these signals. So what are the challenges in glacier studies, and what are the challenges that we will try to give some answer? The main challenge is to quantify the ice mass loss that is related to climate change. And this is also linked to the stability of glaciers and ice sheets. And these ice sheets and glaciers play a key role in the global circulation of the superficial envelope of the Earth and are closely related to atmospheric and oceanic motions. And to understand that, we have to get more insight into the ice flow dynamics. And in this global system, a key role is played by what you can see here, which is a fast-moving marine terminating glacier. And here is an example of the Baudouin Glacier in Greenland. And it has been observed since several years that you have a glacier acceleration and a retreat. And also, it is correlated with an increase of heat flux from the ocean. And all these processes generate increase of ice mass loss. And this ice mass loss is partly due to surface and submarine melting, but also to iceberg calving, as you can see here. And about 1/3 to about 1/2 of the ice mass loss of this glacier is related to iceberg calving. But we have very few information on the real volume of this loss. And in particular, a big uncertainty in ice sheet models is the calving, what we call calving loss, which means the localization of and volume of icebergs. And we will see as to whether we can recover this volume from the seismic signal generated by iceberg calving. So here you can see an example of this iceberg calving with a movie that has been recorded in Greenland. And here you have the seismic station that is at few kilometers from the iceberg calving. You will see here iceberg calving and another calving, and you see that it generates seismic waves. And I don't know if you had time to see it, but you have first iceberg that is turning what we call bottom out, and another one that will turn top out. And when they turn, they exert a force on the glacier terminus that generate these waves that you can see here. You can just look again at the movie, and you will see first an ice avalanche here, then a big iceberg calving here, and after a smaller iceberg calving here. And you can see that the small iceberg here generate waves with the same amplitude as the big one. So it's not so simple to recover iceberg volume just by looking at this seismic data. And so Veitch and Nettles in 2012 have shown that there is an increase of these ice quakes, but we have no information on the increase of the volume of these events. So now concerning landslides, the main challenge is to understand and quantify their occurrence, and especially in link with external forcing, for example, seismic forcing or volcanic forcings, and also when they occur to predict the velocity and runout extent of these events. And this is related to granular flow mechanics, and in particular, one of the big questions is to explain and quantify what we call the high mobility of natural landslides. And to address all this challenge, the big problem is the lack of field measurement of their dynamics, because in general, these processes are unpredictable, destructive, and also inaccessible. So for landslide, we know that the occurrence of landslide is obviously related to seismic activity, to deformation, and to rain here, but we don't know how to quantify we don't know the relative contribution of this forcing for triggering landslides. And once the landslide occurs, so you can see here a picture of Montserrat, it has been observed for all landslides of big volume that they travel over distances much bigger than what is expected from granular physics. And this is still an open issue. So again, as you have seen for icebergs, we can have combine cameras and seismic station to observe these events. And here you can see cameras that we install with OVPF on the crater Dolomio in La Réunion. And you can see that when moving down the slope, this landslide or rockfall generates seismic waves, and you can calculate the energy that is released seismically from these events. And typically what you see from this picture, that there is a link, a direct link between the duration of the seismic signal and the duration of the rockfalls. So I come back to the first question: how can we extract information from seismic data? And we know that seismic signal is a convolution of what happened at the source, and also convoluted by the wave path of the field. So the source generates a force, and this force generates seismic data, seismic signal, and this force actually varies with a lot of things, which is the difficulty of this problem. It varies with mass, geometry. For iceberg, it varies with buoyant equilibrium, with interaction with the surrounding waters, and for landslide, it varies also with rheology, topography, and so on. And for low-frequency data, we can easily, in some way, remove the signature of the wave path, but for high-frequency data, it's much more difficult because of the role of Earth's heterogeneity and the topography. You can see here a simulation of a wave field on the topography of Piton de la Fournaise, and you see that the topography changes the wave field, and you will have, for example, higher amplitude here than here. So this is a challenge in seismology, for example. So the general idea that we addressed since several years is to extract information from seismic signal by using numerical models. And the idea is to develop models that quantify the link between the processes. They will quantify the link between the mass, the velocity, the topography, and so on, in a physical way, in some sense. And what is very useful for landslide and iceberg, for example, is that we have some optic data, some movies, and we can check if our model represents the physics of the processes, which is something quite different for earthquakes. And as an example, you can see here the simulation of a landslide that occurs here and is flowing down a valley here. And you can see the simulation at 2 times. And from this simulation, we can calculate the force in black here that the landslide exerts on the terrain. And we can compare this force from the force that is inverted from seismic data. I will come back to this later. And you can see that, depending on time, you have a strong change of this force in direction, amplitude, and also intensity. And so this is the key of our approach, is to use all this information of direction, amplitude, what we call force history, to compare with simulation and try to find the parameters that best fit the observation. You have the same kind of simulation for iceberg calving here, where you have the iceberg that calves at different time, and you can see in color the intensity of the force. This is the stress here that is applied on the glacier terminus, and it also changes in amplitude and directions. So I will first show you some results that we obtained for glaciers using what we call the low frequency signal. And by low frequency, I mean frequency between 0.01 and 0.1 hertz, which is typically 10 100 seconds in periods. So when we have this low frequency signal, it's quite easy to find the force from the seismogram using classical techniques used in seismology, because the signal is a convolution of the Green's function and the force at the source. And by making deconvolution of this signal, we can recover the force here. And you can see the force that we get that varies in time here in red. And you can see amplitudes with 10 to the power 10 Newton approximately. So what we obtain from this deconvolution is this 3 is represented here. we have a force in the east direction, in the north direction, and vertical direction that change in time. And you can see that this force that is represented in black here as a function of time is very different and much more complex than what was obtained with very simple models before, which are what we call CFS model, that only represent one down and one signal down and one signal up. And so this signal was before interpreted as just one iceberg calving. But if we use our force and we filter it in different frequency bands, here, for example, 0.02 to 0.1 hertz, and here 0.01, 0.02 hertz, we see very different events. We see, for example, here 3 events. And if we look at the movies for some events, we see here ice avalanche, here iceberg calving, bottom out, here iceberg calving, top out. So this is 2 kinds of rotation. And here at very low frequency, we see the motion of the ice melange that is generated by the iceberg that impact the ocean around. So you see here that we have a lot of information that were not seen before. So now that we have all this information, the question is, can we model this process, this iceberg calving, calculate a force, and then compare the force with the force inverted from seismic data to recover the best parameters that will explain our signal. And so, and ultimately, is it possible from this comparison to recover the volume of the iceberg? So what we use here is a finite element model that has been developed in École des Mines Paris Tech. I will not enter into the details of the equations, but it describes the dynamics of an iceberg that is rotating around an elastic walls. And what we did, we vary the parameters that we think are important in the force that is generated. So what is important is the thickness of the iceberg, the aspect ratio, which is the ratio between the width and the height of the iceberg, and also a very important thing is the initial position of the iceberg compared to the neutrally buoyant iceberg. So if you have an iceberg higher, it will oscillate in time, and the same if it's lower than the neutrally buoyant equilibrium. So we calculate, we did a lot of simulation by varying this quantity according to the observation, which is typically 600 meter and 1 kilometer height iceberg. And so this is a 2D model, and we recover the real force by multiplying our force by unit length by the typical length of the icebergs. So what are the results? So I show you some simulations. You can see the iceberg rotating at different time, and the colors here represent the intensity of the force by unit length that the iceberg apply on the glacier here, on the wall. And so if we look in more details into this force, you can see that it increases in time as the iceberg rotates, and it reaches a maximum, and then the icebergs detach from the glacier, and then the force goes down very quickly, down to 0. And so now we have to filter this force, because the force that is accessible from seismic data is only a filtered force. We don't have an absolute force. So if we filter this simulation, we obtain this signal, this force here, which is in black dashed line. And you see that if we just look at this force, it seems like there is a positive and negative force. But indeed, these positive and negative force are not physical, they are related to the filtering process. And before, it has been interpreted as a real positive and negative force related to acceleration or deceleration of the glacier, for example. So we have to be very careful by analyzing physically the seismic signals that are intrinsically filtered. So here you can see the frequency of the force, and you can see that we have a variation between 0.01 to 0.5 hertz, for example. And now we can try to get insight into what makes this force change before comparing with seismic data. So to do that, we made a catalog of 1,000 models, which means that we simulate a lot of iceberg calving by varying the thickness of the iceberg and the aspect ratio. And first, we wanted to see if it gives forces that are in agreement with observation. So we calculate the filtered force amplitude, and we recover really the range of amplitude that we observe from seismic data. So now, if we look carefully at this force, and we vary, for example, the thickness of the iceberg, and kept constant the aspect ratio, we see that the force increases, obviously, with the thickness of the iceberg, but the shape of the force is not really changed. Here, I just put the filtered signal here. Now, if we change the aspect ratio here, we get a force that is quite different in shape from the smaller aspect ratio. And when we filter this force, we see a much higher amplitude of the filtered force, even though the absolute force has about the same amplitude. And indeed, it is what explains the difference between bottom-out and top-out force that is observed on the field. So now, the first idea, can we get the maximum amplitude of the force and just deduce the volume, which would be very simple and good, in fact. So here I represented the maximum force amplitude in colors here as a function of the thickness and aspect ratio, and I superimposed the lines of equal volume here, and you can see that, for example, if you follow this line, which has the same volume, you could have very different force amplitude. So it means that it's not impossible to recover the volume of the iceberg just by looking at the maximum amplitude of the force. And what we really need is to use the full force history to be able to say something about the volume of the force. So another point which is critical is that the force indeed varies depending on the initial position of the icebergs. So if we take equilibrium iceberg, which is neutrally buoyant, then you have this blue force here that corresponds to what I showed you just before. But now if you, for example, move up the iceberg, which is the case actually in the field because they are linked to glacier terminus, they are not at the equilibrium stability, then you reach this black line, and this black force here, you see, has some oscillation related to the motion of the iceberg. And if we filter this, we see that the force in non-equilibrium iceberg has much higher frequencies than the force which is generated by iceberg in equilibrium. And it gives very nice spectrogram, these non-equilibrium icebergs. And you see that, for example, in these spectrograms, we have a kind of a hole and no amplitude in frequencies about 0.02 Hertz. And it is clearly visible on the normalized spectral amplitude. You see no amplitude in this frequency range. And you don't see at all this if you have equilibrium icebergs. And what is very interesting is that we can really recover the signature of this in real data. So here I show you a spectrogram that is related to the force observed in the field with seismic data. So we really see now that if we compare in details our simulation with observation, it will be possible to recover maybe all these informations. And it's what we try to do in the framework of the PhD of Amandine Sergent. And so we took a real iceberg that has been recorded by cameras where we know the thickness of the iceberg, which is about 800 meters, the aspect ratio and the length. And so we can calculate the volume of this iceberg, which is about 0.4 cubic kilometer. So now that we have this, we take the signal, invert it, recover the force in green here as a function of time, so the force history, and compare it with all the battery of simulations that we did. And we find what we call the best model, which is the model that have the maximum variance reduction. And it is the red model here. And you can see that we can really good reproduce the observations. And there is a very few difference between the best model and the inverted force. So now that we have this best model, we come back to the initial parameters that we put inside, and it gives these values in red here. And you see that this is the map of the variance reduction, which this white colors representing the best model, the maximum of variance reduction. So if we look at the values that we found from numerical model, we get very similar value to those observed on the field, and the volume is very close to the real volume. So thanks to this approach and to the catalog of simulations that we have done for one time, we don't need to do that anymore. We can do that for a long period of time and recover the time evolution of the volume of icebergs, and then we will correlate it with the climate change. So now, can we do that for landslides? Because landslides are much more complex indeed. They involve materials that are changing with time, that are presence of water and very different things. They flow over complex topography. So can we do the same approach for landslides? So this is what I will present here. And typically, each landslide is different from the other. In one landslide, we will have water, in another one, you will have erosion process, and so on. So I illustrate the methodology on one event that we studied. And for this particular landslide, which is the Mont Steller rock ice avalanche that occurs in Alaska, we know that there is a big role of erosion. That means that the landslide, when it flows down the slope, it erodes materials and kind of double its volume. And the question is our erosion process changing the dynamics of landslide? Could it explain some mobility of this landslide and so on? So you can see the landslide here, which is represented by the red star. And this landslide started here, flowing down 9 kilometers with a volume of about 40 to 60 million of cubic meter. And we think that about 20 million of cubic meter from field observation, geologists measured it on the field, that about 20 million of cubic meter are related to material eroded along the slope. So this landslide has been recorded by a lot of seismic stations, up to 400 kilometers. And you can see an example of the seismic signal recorded at 40 kilometers. And in black, you see what we call the raw data, what you measure on the field. And in blue, you see what comes from the filtering. And you see the oscillation of the force, which is the same kind of data that we had for icebergs. So, I will then show you simulation and inversion of seismic data. But before showing simulation, I just want to give you the kind of models that we use to simulate these events. And so these models for landslide, I will go very quick into these equations, but the modeling of landslide is difficult because it is mainly driven by topography, and describing topography requires high computational cost. And we need to make some approximation to be able to do this simulation. And one of the big approximations is to say that this is shallow flows. So it means that the thickness of this flow is much smaller than the length of these flows along the slope. And so we have a small aspect ratio, and we take the Navier-Stokes equation and we simplify them by assuming small thickness, small variation of topography, a mean velocity, and so on. And we derive this equation to get a simple, not so simple, but much more simple than Navier-Stokes equation, simple balance between inertia, gravity, which is the main driving force, gradient of pressure, which makes it possible to reproduce the deformation of the mass along the topography. And the dissipation term here is quite well described by Coulomb friction law. And here is a Coulomb friction, mu, and the Coulomb friction says that the dissipation is proportional to the normal stress and times the Coulomb friction. And here, this is a term that is related to centrifugal acceleration when the mass is flowing down complicated topography. So what is important to remind to follow the rest of the talk is that this Coulomb friction in some way is an empirical law, empirical description of dissipation. And if it would have been a real friction law, the friction angle that we should use for glass bits, it corresponds to the slope angle, stability angle of granular mass. It's typically 25 degrees. But for real debris that are more complex, the typical friction angle is 35 degrees. You will see that it will be quite different, but this is what happened. So we developed this code in 3D and simulate the landslide that I showed you before. So first scenario, we just let the whole mass, release the whole mass and let it flows down the topography, and you can see the deposits that we obtained from the numerical model, where the different colors here represent the thickness of the material. Now we investigate the role of erosion. So we just release half, for example, of the mass on the topography, and here we put materials on the slope that could be eroded by the flow coming down. So you have the mass flowing down, eroding material, and then you have the final deposits. So now, is it possible to discriminate between these two scenarios and to compare them with observations? So this is what you can see here. When we look from the top here, we have this deposit and this deposit here. And the black line here corresponds to the real deposit observed on the field. And you can see that there is no means, if you just have the contour of the deposit, there is no means to discriminate between the two scenarios because they give the same deposit area. What would be possible is to discriminate between the two would be to have the thickness distribution of the landslide, which is very difficult and very rare, in fact. So it was something that was blocking the community before. And the thing is that now we can use seismic data to discriminate and get information about the dynamics. And it's what I show here. So here in red, you can see the force that we inverted from seismic data, exactly in the same way that we did for icebergs. You can see this force here in vertical north and east direction, and it's typically 10 to the power 11 Newton. And so just to understand intuitively what happened, if you have a block on a slope, it will first accelerate and generate a force in the opposite direction. You see a positive force in the vertical direction, which corresponds to that, and then it will decelerate and generate a negative force. So this is really acceleration, deceleration, but you see fluctuation related to topography and so on. So we have this force. This is our data now. And if we compare the simulation with the scenario without erosion, which is in green here, you can see that it's completely different to what is observed. But now if we take erosion into account, this is the blue line here, we recover much better the force inverted from seismic data. So from this example, you can see that a careful comparison between force inverted from seismic data and force simulated with landslide makes it possible, for example here, to say that erosion is necessary to reproduce the signal, and even we can constrain the volume that has been eroded. So I show you another example here, and so that I just talked before a little bit, just to show you the variability of the force. And you can see it's another landslide, and this is the mass that is released, that is flowing down the topography. And you can see the simulated force in black, and compare, you can see that it reproduces quite well, as a function of time, the direction and magnitude of the force that is inverted from seismic data. But what control actually the direction and amplitude of the force? There is a lot of things, as I said before. There is the mass that is released. Was it one mass or several mass? The topography also plays a role. And the friction coefficient, remember the dissipation that we put into the model, is a key factor, because if you have low friction, it will go very fast down the slope. If you have high friction, it will be slower, and then it will completely change the force history. So we can get insight into this friction coefficient by making a sensitivity analysis of the model. And typically, we vary the friction coefficient between 14 here to 21 here in blue. And we compare the simulation in the different colors here. And we compare it to the waveform inverted from seismic data in red here. And for example, if we look at this, you see that the effect of friction is not so simple. For example, here you have high friction that generate in blue higher force in vertical direction, and just after, high friction generate lower force. And it really depends on the interaction of rheology with topography. And so if you analyze all this and find, again, the best model, you come up with a friction coefficient of 18 degrees. And remember, I told you that the natural friction coefficient of debris is about 35. So it's really different from 18 degrees. And it is really illustrating what we call the high mobility of landslides that have smaller dissipation than what we expect, and we don't really know why. So what we did a lot of this kind of studies that are represented here by the red cases here, and we reported the friction coefficient that we found from seismic data here as a function of the volume of the landslide that was involved. So Moretti et al. Here represents the landslide that I showed you before. Remember, it was about 50 million of cubic meter. Brodsky et al. Did similar things maybe with simple models with bigger landslide. And we did it also for smaller landslide in Switzerland and in Japan. And we see a decrease of this calibrated friction coefficient as a function of volume. And this is in very good agreement with all the symbols that you see here that represent the friction coefficient deduced from landslide deposits, simulation of landslide deposits for a lot of landslides on Earth, but also on other planets. And this was done by Antoine Lucas in 2014. So we see that combining data on the dynamics and data on the deposits, all the studies suggest that we have a decrease of the dissipation. I will not say friction coefficient, but the dissipation as the volume increases, and we don't know why. But this is not the object of the talk. I could speak about later, but and the thing is that, as you see, we have data for big landslide because these big landslides generate low frequency data, but smaller landslide doesn't generate low frequency data, only high frequency, and it is much more tricky to get information from high frequency data. And this will be the final things of my talk, how we can get insight into the high frequency signal that we all know intuitively that is generated by granular impacts and not by this long period acceleration-deceleration process. So the first thing is to go to laboratory experiments that really makes it possible to identify the physical process. So what we did in collaboration with Institut Langevin and EOST, we did some laboratory experiments where we released some granular mass on inclined planes, and we use fast cameras to recover the evolution of the profile of the mass, as well as the velocity. Here, the color represents the velocity of the grains. And at the same time, we put accelerometers and re-record the acoustic, we say acoustic in laboratory, but it's seismic in some way, the acoustic waves that are generated on the plane here. And all the question, remember what we try to relate seismic signal to flow property. The main question is that, is this signal related to the mean dynamics of the flow? that we can capture with our optic data. And I show you one example. There is a very good correlation indeed between the seismic energy that is generated, that I represented here in full lines for different slope angles. So from 0 horizontal plane here in red to 20 degrees inclination in purple. And we see that this seismic energy is really well correlated to the loss of potential energy, which is represented here by the dashed lines for all the slope angles that we get. And this is also what we observe for all the shape of the mass, all the dimension, and so on. So these granular experiments show us that there is a link between seismic energy and loss of potential energy, and evermore, we can quantify the transfer of energy, and we can see that actually only 10 to the power minus 4 of the loss of potential energy is transferred into seismic waves. But now the question is why seismic energy is related to loss of potential energy, because the idea is that this seismic energy is related to microscopic effect, which is collision of particles. So to try to get more insight into that, we did other laboratory experiments, much simpler. So we release a mass here on a plane, and we try to reproduce almost steady uniform flows. And you can see here the bits that are flowing down and that are captured by even higher resolution camera, 5,000 images per second. And from this data, we can calculate all. We can calculate the mean velocity of the flow, the strain rate, which is the gradient of the mean velocity, and also a very important thing, we can measure the particle fluctuation, owing that collision are related to, will occur at velocity which correspond to particle fluctuation, to the difference between the velocity of one particle and the other. So when we do that, what we observe that the seismic energy per second, which is related to the energy, seismic energy I showed before, here correlate with the mean properties of the flow indeed. It correlated with the strain rate times the diameter, or it's another way to say that it correlates with the mean velocity. And so here, each point represents one of our data. So you see that we don't have a lot of data. We need to get more. But still, we can see a correlation increase of seismic energy as a function of the mean velocity. And thanks to our measurement of fluctuation, we can see indeed that these mean properties are in fact related to the fluctuation of particles. So it is natural to have a link between seismic energy and mean properties, even though they are generated by microscopic collisions. So with all this in mind, we come back to the field and try to interpret seismic data. And we will try actually to relate seismic energy to loss of potential energy. But this is not easy at all on the field. It's not like in laboratory experiments. For example, in Cratère Dolomieu, in Piton de la Fournaise, we have a signal, but we don't know the volume of the event. We don't know how far it goes, etc. So what we did, we tried to mimic natural events and simulate a lot of landslide everywhere in the crater. We put several volumes, several shapes, etc. And then we obtain a series of simulations and series of loss of potential energy. And this is something that I show you here. So first, each point here represents one rockfall that is observed on the seismic station installed around the crater. And you can see that if we plot the seismic energy as a function of the seismic duration, we see what we call a power law, which is seismic energy is proportional to duration to the power beta, where beta is about 1.7, for example. And if now we plot our simulations, we have also a lot of simulation, and we find exactly the same power law, which is the loss of potential energy is related to the flow duration this time. But remember the movie that I showed you before, we observed in the field that the duration of seismic signal is the same as the direction of the flow. So we can directly compare the loss of potential energy and seismic energy. And again, we find an energy ratio of 10 to the power minus 4, which is in very good agreement with what we found at the laboratory scale. So now that we have this, everything is kind of solved, because the loss of potential energy can be related analytically to the volume of the mass, of the rockfall. So we can have a relation that gives the volume from the seismic energy, and this formula involves parameters like the mean slope of the crater, for example. So from this relation, we can calculate the volume of all the events that we observe seismically, and it gives this kind of distribution where we have maximum volume of 3,000 and a few volumes much bigger and a lot of smaller volume. And if we calculate the cumulative volume and compare it with observations, we find we have a quite good agreement with what is found on the field. So is it something special to La Réunion, or is it observed in a lot of situations? So to check that, we apply the same method to another site, which is the Montserrat Island, where there have been a lot of rockfall and pyroclastic flows. And we find again the same relation. We find the seismic energy that's scaled with the seismic direction to a power beta here, which is about 3. So here, all points represent one rockfall, and we see that we get the same scaling law. So we did the same. We did a lot of simulation in the different valleys where we observe the rockfalls, because indeed this parameter depends on the topography. And we find something that is not working at all, actually. For example, if we take 35 degrees for the friction angle, which is the value that we took for this small rockfall, which is the value that is expected from granular physics, then we are able to recover the direction of the smaller event, but not at all the duration of the bigger event. And if we decrease this friction coefficient empirically, we are only able to recover the behavior of large landslides. So what we did is to use the empirical friction laws that I showed you before, that decrease, where the friction coefficient decreases with volume, and not, without fitting any parameters, we reproduce very well the observations, the scaling law observed from seismic data. So this suggests strongly that we have a friction weakening that is compatible with this formula, and that this makes it possible. This only makes it possible to reproduce seismic data. So through this very indirect way of constraining the friction, we have some constraint on the friction coefficient of this small volume from this high frequency data. So finally, I will just illustrate how these methods can help monitoring landslide activity and get better insight into their correlation with volcanic and climatic, etc. activity. So this is the work done by Virginie Durand here. And we took 3 years of data here. And we took the catalog that was that is built by the OVPF, and from this catalog we can calculate the location of the rockfall thanks to seismic data, and we can calculate the volume of this rockfall as I showed you before. So this is a complicated figure, but here we are represented in red the average volume of the rockfalls as a function of time. And you can see that in the majority of time, you have volumes smaller than about 3,000 cubic meter, but sometimes you have what we call crisis, rockfall crisis, with very high volumes occurring. And we name this crisis from A to Q, for example. And so the question is, are these crises related to volcanic activity? And so to try to investigate that, we correlate this observation with, for example, the number of volcanotectonic events, because we know that this volcanotectonic event generates seismic waves that can destabilize the rockfalls. We correlate it with the maximum amplitude, with the deformation, and also with the rainfall. So by doing that, the best correlation that we found was between the average volume of rockfall and the seismicity, which is the number of volcanotectonic events. So here you can see the cumulated number of volcanotectonic events over 10 days, and we see that between 1 to 10 days after this increase of seismicity, we observed large volume triggered on the crater. And this large volume are always related to this seismicity. Just for this event, we have no link. And if we look, it's difficult to say something about the deformation because it is very similar to volcanotectonic event. So we don't really know which is the real triggering factor. And if we look for rainfall, we find a correlation. So big volumes occur after about 3 days of 1 to 3 days of rainfall, but rainfall alone could not generate big volume. If you have, for example, here large rainfall and no big volumes that are released. So in our first approach, it seems that large rockfall are triggered by seismicity, and rain generate rockfall, but never big rockfall alone. It can be an additional triggering factor. And finally, we can look at the spatio-temporal distribution of this crisis. And what is interesting, obviously, is to see if there is a correlation between these events and the eruptions that are represented here in green during this 3 years period. So we will look at the spatio-temporal distribution of these 3 crises, and it will be my final figure. And so here you can see the crater here. This region corresponds to the big slope of the crater, and we always have a rockfall here. But now if we look on the rest of the crater, and we represent the location of the rockfalls during these 4 crises. So each color corresponds to a crisis before an eruption. So for example, the eruption 2 occurs here, and we see that before, so the change in colors from light to dark represents the day before the eruption. So here is about 9 days before the eruptions. And we see a big volume that occur near the location of the second eruption. For the eruption 5 also, we have a big volume that occur before the eruption in the direction of this eruption, and so on. So this is very first results, and maybe if we will look at the 10 years of data, we will not see that. But it seems maybe that there is a migration of these big rockfalls towards the location of the future eruption, which is something that physically could make sense. So to conclude, and more to give some perspective, we have seen that we can extract a lot of information from seismic data, but owing to a complex process of modeling and comparisons. And the main objective that we have for this kind of studies is to develop more accurate model to better interpret the low frequency, but also the high frequency data. And a key point also is to investigate and quantify the effect of the generated waves on the flow itself. For example, for landslide, are the waves generated changing the dynamics of the landslide itself? It's a main question, and it may contribute to explain the high mobility of landslide. And we want to quantify ice mass loss in Greenland in link with climate change, and also rockfall activity in link with volcanic activity. So thank you very much for being here. Yeah, there are quite big difference. The first difference is that the signal of an earthquake is starting very abruptly. You have a direct increase of the ground velocity, while for the seismic signal generated by landslide, you have what we call emergent signal. Also, the shape of the envelope is different, and also the typical frequencies are different. And there are a lot of studies now that started about 10 years ago where we have some characteristics of rockfall signals, making it possible to discriminate it from earthquake or volcanotectonic events and so on.
And does a seismic record can tell us something about the fluid content or rock moisture or whatever you call it of the landslide?
Yeah, so there is two ways to answer to that. For example, for very small density flows where you have essentially water, it has been shown for a river, for example, that the turbulence of water also generates some seismic signal, and that you can use this seismic data to recover a flux, for example, of the river or so on. And for landslide, a good thing is that when you have water, it can change totally the behavior of the landslide, and it's obvious in simulation. And we are really seeing that by comparing with seismic data, we will see the differences associated to the presence of water.
I get a little confused about the word data. When you say you compare to data, do you tend to compare to an inverse model from seismic data? And if so, what is the uncertainty on the inverse model that becomes the data?
So it's what I explained since the beginning. So we compare the seismic, the simulation with the force inverted from seismic data, is what I call data. And for example, here, I don't know if, yes, you can see it here. Okay. So for example, here you have the force inverted from seismic data, and in light red, you have the uncertainty of the inversions that we made. And typically, one of the big source of uncertainty is the Earth model, what we call the Earth model, which is the Green's function that we don't know really well in a lot of places. And I think this is a much important source of errors, because, for example, when we invert this force, a very interesting thing is that using only one station, we can get a very accurate force. This is something that we have shown in different environments. So the couverture of the seismic station is not so important in the error. Mostly the uncertainty of Earth's heterogeneity.
Sohan, you explained that in order to explain the power law between energy and duration, you need this friction weakening phenomenon. But on the other hand, on your La Réunion results, you seem not to need that. Is that just because you're exploring a very small range of energies, or why?
Yeah, it's exactly, it's because for La Réunion we have very small volumes. So we are in the region where the friction angle is a natural friction angle, 35 degrees. But in Montserrat, we have a very large range of volume that goes up to 2 million of cubic meter. And then we have this effect that we don't understand of friction reduction with increase in volume.
Yeah. I have a question. When you compute the volume of ice that has slided, can you distinguish what part of the volumes come from erosion and what part of the volume come from not eroding part? Yeah?
Actually, the only thing that the things that we simulate, we don't have erosion in the sense maybe that you speak about. We just have a mass that immediately detached from the glacier and rotates around the glacier terminus. This is what we model. So we have the model of the iceberg that is supposed to be detached from the glacier terminus. Is that what you were asking?
Because when you showed in your landslide simulation that erosion that erosion was an important effect to consider. So I was thinking that maybe you could estimate maybe the volume of eroded mass during the landslide. Maybe it's a naive question.
No, it's actually for ice there is no erosion, but for landslide, there is erosion. And by comparing seismic signal with force inverted, we can in fact constrain the volume of material that has been eroded. Yeah, this is something that we can do with uncertainties, obviously.
When you say that you will compare with the climate change, the mass, the ice loss, so how far back in time can you go to do that?
Typically, maybe 20 to 30 years, 20 years, because it's a very short period of climate change, actually. Yeah, but it's only a period where we have seismic data. But I think that even though it's a very short period, we can understand the relation between temperature change and the dynamics of glaciers. In some way, it's what we do when we have a lot of events. We compare for one event with one camera, and then we deduce some general tendencies.
Pas d'autres questions?
Yeah, I have one. Did you look into the possibility of seeing some precursor signal, or because you look into the signal as it unravels, but to some extent, is there any sign before the iceberg breaks, for instance, or before the landslide happens? Can you see anything, or is just quiet?
So what some people have tried to do is, or observed, is cracks, for example, before iceberg calving, or cracks, for example, in Alaska, when just before a big event, or sometimes some rockfalls before a big landslide. But in general, at least for these cracks that generate much higher frequencies than everything that I showed you, we have to put station just on the site. So we have to know a priori where it can happen. And there are also techniques that have been developed in ISTER in Grenoble, very nice techniques where they have an unstable rock and they put some seismometers on top. They will lose it, but then they see the own oscillation of the fréquence propre of the rock. And just before instability, you can clearly see a change of these frequencies. But everything is very local.
Yeah, coming back to this slide, is it the unique way to get a calving of a glacier with a contact force? In some cases, you don't get the piece of the glacier moving away without contact force. How does that happen?
Exactly.
In that case, how can you make mass balance if you get calving without seismic signal?
This method only makes it possible to recover the volume from seismic data when you have this rotation. And in Greenland, this is the main rotation process. And actually, exactly what you say, you have rotation when you have a given aspect ratio of the glacier. When it starts to be longer, more and width, you don't have, it's very stable. So it will do that, but never rotates. And for example, in Antarctica, it's what happened in general. You have these very thin icebergs that just detach, they don't rotate. So this is true for this kind of icebergs that are mostly observed in Greenland. But also for very thin iceberg and very large, you have even better insight from satellite imagery. So I think seismology will not be the method but combined with satellite imagery, it will really help, I think, especially in time resolution.
Plus de questions? Donc vous pouvez continuer à poser des questions à Anne à la médiathèque autour du buffet, hein, si vous voulez. Merci encore.
Merci.